This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
And it's been 10 years since a serial killer kidnapped and murdered a Vermont couple. First up this morning, a look at the crime that rocked Vermont. Bill and Lorraine Currier were last seen at their home in Essex Junction on June 8th, 2011. A massive search went on for months. Their bodies were never found. Authorities say Israel Keys traveled the country for years, killing strangers. He confessed to 3 murders, the Curriers, and a woman from Alaska. But investigators believe he killed 11 people, at least. Keys took his own life behind bars. Channel 3 News broke the story 10 years ago that Israel Keys was the prime suspect in the murders. Former investigative reporter Jennifer Costa pieced together what happened, identifying where the serial killer was the night the Curriers disappeared. Her story on WCAX shocked Vermont. And Jennifer Costa joins us now to talk about that case. Jennifer, good morning.
Good morning.
So as I said, this case is still just so hard to believe. Vermont lost some, innocence from this horrific crime. Once we found out exactly what happened, walk us through the early days in the investigation before Israel Keys was linked to the murders of Bill and Lorraine Currier.
So, Darren, I think as journalists, we all have these stories that stick with us despite the passage of time. And for me, this is definitely that story. And you just touched on it, but Vermont truly did lose this sense of innocence with this case. Sure, we see crime in Vermont, but not the level of this pure evil that we saw emerge in this case. The early days were kind of a scramble. I don't know what the police knew in those first couple of days and weeks, but as members of the media, we weren't sure exactly what we were dealing with. Was it just a missing persons case? Was it a case of domestic violence, as we often see when a husband and wife are involved? Would this become a murder-suicide? There were so many unanswered questions, to the point that I even remember looking into Bill and Lorraine Currier themselves. Was there a reason that they may want to disappear? And that was kind of the tricky thing with this case. Adults can disappear, and it's not necessarily a crime. But then when you weigh that with all of the red flags that started to emerge, we saw a really concerning picture. There was the busted window at their house, the cut phone line at their home, medications left behind. Then we found out from police there had been no activity on their bank accounts. Later, friends and family would speak publicly about how concerned they were and how out of character this was for Bill and Lorraine to go off the radar, to not show up at their jobs. Then there was I remember a neighbor telling us about a dog. Her dog, the night that they disappeared, was kind of going crazy. And, it's just that feeling when you look back, and hindsight is 20/20. She was telling us how she just wishes that she had paid more attention to her dog that night. But she didn't think much about it at the time. And it was months before we in the media realized that we were dealing with a murder case.
And what's so frightening about this is that it was completely random.
Absolutely. Statistically, murder is not a random act. Most of the time, the killer ends up having some sort of connection to his victims. And so, yes, this was completely terrifying. As the weeks went by, the level of fear in the community really grew. And what we would later learn about Israel Keys is, though Bill and Lorraine Currier were random, he would plan these kill scenarios, if you will, for himself, almost as if it was a really sick game. So he would set these parameters for himself when he came to a specific location, and then hunt for victims that matched that set of parameters. And in this case, he sat at a nearby convenience store and just waited for someone who matched his description that he had come up with in his mind. And I think about that all the time because back when this case broke, I lived very close to the Couriers, within a couple of miles, and I frequented this gas station. Israel Keyes could very well have followed me home, or any number of the other people who went to this gas station. And it was just so tragic that Bill and Lorraine fit his scenario in his mind. And what that was is he was looking for a couple who did not have children, who did not have a dog, and who lived in a ranch home. Why he picked those set of parameters, we'll never know. And, as more details emerged as the weeks and months went by of this case, we actually learned that he planned these murders in great detail, to the degree that he had been to Vermont before. He had stashed kill kits with all the supplies that he would need on prior trips, and then he would go back and access those kits. And he did this all around the country. Vermont was certainly not unique in that way.
You broke this story before police identified Keyes as the suspect. How did you piece this all together?
This was such a complicated case with so many layers. And I think you have to look at it through the lens of what we knew at the time. So in Vermont, all we knew is that we had a missing couple. And it was the biggest story that happened in this region at that time. So we, as members of the media, were tracking every development in this case. Every time police were somewhere and it was linked to this case, we were right there on the scene trying to figure out what was going on. And we had, potential spottings of their car. We had a person of interest sketch. And then finally, there was this big excavation at a property a couple of miles from the Courier's home. And so again, you have to remember that at this time, we didn't have a suspect. We didn't have a name. And at this point, we didn't know anything other than a couple had disappeared. So one day while we were at that dig site off Route 15 in Essex, I got a call on my cell phone. And to this day, I have no idea who it was. It was a restricted number. I didn't recognize the voice. And they told me that if I was following the Courier case, then I needed to check out the front page of a newspaper in Texas and look for the arrest of an Alaska man. And this just came out of left field. My mind was kind of blown as to what was even happening. So I called back to the station looking for some help because I had limited cell phone service. How was I going to track down newspapers? Where would this tip even coming from? And so I started looking around for exactly that. And I found it. And it was the story of a guy who had been arrested for speeding. Police had found rolls of cash in his car. And the suspect's name was Israel Keyes. That was the first time we had heard that name. That now is just, the name is so notorious in Vermont, but no one had heard it at the time. So Israel Keyes from Alaska. And I was looking at this front page photo and looking at it. I'm like, why does he look so familiar to me? And I started going back through all of my files that I had on this case, and I realized that he matched the person of interest sketch that police had released a few days after the couple had disappeared. And it was a person of interest sketch of someone thought to be seen driving their car. So I called our sister station in Alaska at that point to see if I could find out anything about this guy. And together, myself and the reporter there discovered that Israel Keyes at that time was a person of interest in a murder case there, an 18-year-old barista by the name of Samantha Koenig. But I still couldn't find any connection to Keyes here in Vermont until I chased down another tip that the killer or the person who had abducted them had stayed in an area motel. So one night I was out for a run and I just on a whim decided something was nagging at me, and I decided to stop at a hotel that was closest to the crime scene and just take a shot. And I showed the sketch to the clerk, and I shared the name. She said that he kind of looked familiar, but she wasn't that sure. But then when I gave her the name, she looked it up in the computer, and lo and behold, Israel Keyes had checked into the hotel probably about a mile from the Courier's home the day before they were abducted, and he checked out the day after they disappeared. And this was huge. It was the first time that I was able to place Israel Keyes, a murder suspect in Alaska, here in Vermont, and not only place him here in Vermont, but place him within a mile of the victim's home and at the exact time that they disappeared. The case kind of unraveled from there.
The couriers' bodies were never found despite an exhaustive search. Tell us about that.
I cannot imagine how painful this is for the Currier family to never get that closure. We learned later that during the Koenig investigation, Keyes told police where he could find the bodies of a missing Vermont couple, and that's what prompted that dig I referred to a couple minutes ago off Route 15. This dig, it was such, the timing was just awful. So the dig was at this farmhouse. And what we would later find out is Keyes told police that he abducted the Curriers and brought them to this farmhouse where he later killed them, dismembered them, and put them in garbage bags in the basement. Time would pass. This farmhouse was a notorious place for squatters, and it was torn down. So once police got this tip, the farmhouse had already been torn down. So they were digging for a long time beneath the foundation to find whatever evidence they could. At the same time, we learned when a house is torn down in Vermont, one of the places that construction debris goes is the Coventry landfill. So we followed the case up to Coventry, and we found teams of investigators. I can't even tell you. I mean, there were dozens of people in the white suits just combing through months and months of garbage and debris, layers and layers. And as you can imagine, I mean, after months, you're talking about human remains in heat, in winter, in heat again of the summer. It would be like finding a needle in the haystack. And so their bodies were never found to this day.
What else do we know about Israel Keyes?
He was a 34-year-old Army veteran, and the shocking thing about him is he lived a relatively, if you could call it, normal life, almost like a double life. He had a young daughter, and he lived with a woman and this young daughter in Alaska in a normal suburban home. He would later tell investigators, and it was released through FBI tapes, that he was two people, and he had been two people for about 14 years upon his capture. And he described these two lives that he lived, one that no one knew about except for him, and that was these cross-country killings that he would go on in these scenarios. So he was this freelance, self-employed contractor, and I think as far as his family knew, he was leaving Alaska for work and for jobs, and when he would come back, what they didn't know is he would kill people on these trips. And so it's just amazing to me that he could keep that up for so long, that double life. Prior to that, what we've been able to piece together from his background is that he came from a somewhat large, religious, strict family. He told investigators that even as a child, he liked to watch things suffer. Police believe that he has killed at least 11 people, and he had told them the only thing that he regretted was getting caught. And then, of course, we know that he took his own life.
In addition to just how horrific these crimes are and the crime against the Curriers and how heartbreaking it is that this family never got closure, this changed Vermont.
It did, and I think you kind of hit the nail on the head at the beginning. It was this loss of innocence for the state. Like I said, we experienced crime like any other state, but not to this degree. I don't know that anyone linked to this case could have imagined when it started, when they got the first call that Bill and Lorraine Currier had vanished, that it would end in having one of the most notorious serial killers choose Vermont in his path of just evil death and destruction. In my heart, 10 years later, I cannot believe it's been a decade, but my heart just continues to ache for the Currier family and what their loved ones went through then and what the family continues to go through. And then also just for all of the unanswered questions, with Israel Keyes killing himself in prison, he took to his grave so many secrets of other murders that he could have given families closure to and chose not to.
Jennifer Costa, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
fucking guy again. You know, I have a professional reputation and a personal reputation for being inhumanly patient. And it's really frustrating to put yourself in a situation where you decide you're going to report on something that has been misreported in so many different ways, and so many mistakes have been made in how it's presented that people don't listen. I think the most disturbing part of the case of Israel Keys and like who are his victims and where are they is that the way that his cases will be uncovered and resolved will never link back to him. Take the pit latrines, for instance. And I can't get to them all myself, personally. People looking into those latrines, if they ever do it, will never realize, like, how those people are there. There won't be any evidence linking them back to him. Some of the cases that we're going to take a look at this summer are not remains in latrines. But some of them are remains on the side of the road. And when I say side of the road, I mean kind of buried into the thickets where you're crossing state lines. I'm not saying that these cases are necessarily Keys, but I'm saying cases like this, if they were Keys, would never be linked back to him. I've discovered that there's a serious disconnect. There's a disconnect between local and state law enforcement, and then there's a disconnect between state law enforcement and federal law enforcement. And then there's a separate disconnect between the people who operate parks, fisheries, forests, wildlife areas, and people who operate in small towns versus people who operate in cities. So jurisdictionally, Israel Keys was only smart at one thing. The way he happened to commit his crimes and choose to commit his crimes, they're never going to be solved because there's no way to solve them. Even finding human remains today, the people don't care. You find them, push it off, it becomes a local issue. In some of these cases, there's no reason for the locals to even call the state authorities, let alone the federal authorities. These are just bones at this point. We're coming up on the 10-year anniversary of Israel Keys, period. This summer is the 10-year anniversary of the Courier kidnapping and murder. But when you look at that, it's very frustrating to realize that all of the evidence that potentially could have tied him to anything is now gone.
We look at these crime cases, and I just want to point out, like, the mob mentality is never more evident than it is in missing children's cases. And I think you've recently seen a little more of that. And I don't want to risk isolating our audience members, but the truth is, like, I get into that frame of mind too. I have the mob frame of mind, but I don't talk about it out loud. People get on this thing where they think they know what's happened, and they get on a soapbox, and they very clearly will, tell you you're wrong and the family did it, and like all of these crazy things. I like stuff that I like watching the dumpster fires that come from all of that. I don't like it when the dumpster fires spill over and people are affected, like really affected.
Well, and they go for the jugular.
They really do.
That's one of the most interesting things to me is, so I am not on social media, and I've never even been a spectator on the discussions, but recently I became one, and it was having to do with a specific case, and they talk about how these are discussion groups. Right. I don't know if you've seen that or not, but like it, and so they are open to like lots of opinions and lots of, when somebody says something and it's negative and then somebody responds, that's really negative, you shouldn't say that. And then somebody else says, but this is a discussion group.
Right.
And it's like, wait a minute, this isn't like a free pass to be a complete terrible person. A discussion group is not open season on whoever's you're talking about and the situation involved. And that's what they kind of take it as, it seems like.
They really do. And so it gets to the point where those groups come out, and the initial idea is that they're going to talk about these cases. And the whole goal is to see this case resolved. But the longer that a case goes on and is unresolved, and particularly when it comes to missing children, but also missing young adults and missing under mysterious circumstances, when those cases go on a little bit further, those like Facebook groups and Reddit groups and web sleuth groups, they start to fill up with what I call eye rolls. And like, as soon as they start talking, like, you start rolling your eyes.
Like, I was trying to figure out what you meant by that.
Well, I've had to replace, like, I've gotten banned for my language in some places. And I think, I don't post very much. So when I do post, it's generally like, hey, people, simmer down, like, leave that person alone that hasn't been charged with anything. And please don't go burn down their house or something. But I had to replace the word asshole with eye roll. So when I see someone behaving poorly, I know personally that they're an asshole, but what I call them is an eye roll. I said, you don't have to be an eye roll over this, like all one word, all lowercase.
That's a nice way to put it.
Well, I've got a teenager I'm trying to teach how to behave. And then I generally have decided some time ago, before cancel culture stuff started, that like I probably need to leave a positive mark on the world. That's sort of how I've like looked at a lot of things related to these cases, is I need to leave a mark that is as positive as it can be. And I'm not saying like happy. I'm not saying like perfect or goody two shoes. I'm just saying like how I interact with people, I try and make it as positive as possible. And I've not always been that person. So I've had to learn how to do it. And one of the ways is, I've had to stop calling people names, even though some of them clearly deserve the names that I'm calling them. I've had to stop doing it.
Don't you think that's part of growing up though?
It is. It's part of maturing.
I realize that like most of the people I'm kind of watching, which I know some of them are quite a bit older than me, but a lot of them are quite a bit younger than me. And I try to think to myself, well, 20 years ago, I'd probably say the same thing.
Well, it's not that their behavior, it's their behavior that's unjustified, not their thinking. So thinking the way they think is fine, but when everyone says the same thing over and over again, you start to kind of question, like, do they understand that, like, they're just saying the same thing that this other person said? And again, like, true crime is particularly volatile. People, particularly when it's kids, when it's children, I'm right there with them. I just, like, I have this side of me. I'm not particularly religious, but I went to church when I was younger. I went to school events. I spent a lot of time doing different activities where I would end up in places that had a lot of adult interaction. And from a very early age, I knew how to be polite. And I think circumstances, and someone said this to me recently, circumstances where like the stressors are on, the politries fly out the window and people aren't saying please and thank you anymore. They're just saying how they think. And, I have a teenager who is growing up in a generation of people who just say what they think. And it's very interesting to me to watch that happen, because I would have gotten a spanking when I was very small, and not like some horrible beating, but I would have been warned with some corporal punishment not to repeat that behavior. Yeah. And
that's pretty typical of our age group, though.
Yeah, and I'm seeing some 30 to 60-year-old people in here that clearly never got a little spanking.
Or a big one.
But
I don't really have an opinion about whether they should have got a spanking or not. But my biggest problem is, so I know that this sounds counterintuitive to the fact that I am on a podcast about true crime and we talk about things. And it maybe seems really judgmental from this point of view. When I join a group of people who are going to discuss, a missing child's case, I kind of expect the discussion to be about the missing child case. That's not what I'm finding.
Well, we were even talking about our own concerns is we don't want to be those people. So that was part of our concerns. We don't want to be those people. But the other part of our concerns was they do lose focus very quickly.
Well, and that's sort of the point I'm trying to get at, I guess, is, I don't know. I think that maybe it needs to be called something different because it's not about the case. It's about what everybody thinks about the people involved in the case. That's different. That's very different than being about the case.
And that is, so that's sort of where we end up in all of this, is what will ultimately stop that and make it about that case again. And what I think it would be is the case being resolved. Essentially, once the case is no longer like a search and rescue, where, because like for X amount of time, it's a search and rescue. Depending on the case and the terrain and the circumstances, it could be longer than other amounts of time. But then it becomes a recovery effort. And that's when you're looking for a body in water, or you're looking for an abduction victim to be found. And, there have been cases that they sort of surprise us, where we find I think of Elizabeth Smart. With her, we find her months later. There's a more recent case that is the subject of the podcast, 88 Days. That's another case where someone is found alive. And I like those cases. That's the ultimate resolution. And that's what we've been talking about on some of the missing cases that we're following right now, is ultimately we want those children to be found alive. But the further and further you get, the less likely that is, the angrier people become. And really their anger, it's mostly misplaced at the family in some of these cases, or who might look like a logical suspect, but frequently isn't. And until those cases sort of are brought before a court, there's really nothing that people can do about them. And that's a very frustrating situation to find yourself in. And that's one of the interesting things about the Israel Keys case. I have hunted down a lot of missing persons cases where I am ultimately looking for a missing person case that got missed. Several of them, because sometimes people will just be a blip on the radar. Their job will report that they didn't show up, but they don't have family and friends to report that they didn't show up. And ultimately, the FBI has told us that Israel Keys went and took people from remote locations, that it happened all the time, and that once he got these people away from that remote location and disposed of their body, there wasn't a whole lot that was said about them again. Now, the FBI took the browser cache on Israel Keys' computer, and they made a bunch of comparison searches. And we were able to look at them. There's another podcast that calls them the NamUs 44. That's not really accurate information. We don't know that they were NamUs 44. We do know that NamUs was the database that the FBI used, recognized with a K, to compare what was on the browser searches on his computer. And ultimately, a lot of those were essentially matched to open cases. And that's where the NamUs 44 number comes from. There are 44 cases in NamUs that were essentially sitting visible for all of us to see in the FBI files. And if you look up the NamUs numbers, you can tell who they were. And just to recount for listeners, if we sort them by year, the known numbers were Holly Bobo in 2011, Lorraine Currier, Bill Currier, Aaliyah Lunsford, and Amir Jennings in 2011. So that's 5 cases in 2011. Then when we go back to 2009, there were 2 open cases. One was Kayla Berg, who went missing on August 11, 2009. And the other was Lindsay Baum, who was an open case at the time. She went missing June 26, 2009. She has since been at least partially resolved because a portion of her skull cap was found in Washington. She is deceased. In 2007, there was Karen Adams out of Pennsylvania. She went missing on March 12th. Koi Vu went missing out of Washington on April 7th, 2007. Lisa Stebick went missing on April 30th. Kara Kopetsky went missing out of Belton, Missouri on May 4th. Ashley Summers went missing on July 9th out of Ohio. Rupinder Garaya went missing out of Fort Myers, Florida on October the 2nd. And Jalik Rainwalker and Justin Gaines went missing on November 1st and November 2nd out of New York and Georgia, respectively. In 2006, Carla Vincenti went missing out of Newark, New Jersey on February the 9th. Rochelle Smith went missing from Minot, North Dakota in May 17th of 2006. Lori Boffman went missing in Youngstown, Ohio on August the 5th. And then there were 2 cases from December the 1st. That's Trenton Duckett from Florida and Brian DeSantos Gomez out of Florida as well. Then in 2005, on the comparison searches, they found Danielle Imbo and Richard Petrone, who went missing together somewhere between Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Camden, New Jersey on February the 19th of 2005. Bianca Piper was in there, and she went missing from Foley, Missouri on March the 10th. Tony Luzio, he has since been found. He's out of Powell, Ohio. He went missing on July 4th. So now his case is also closed and archived. Christine Hamilton went missing from Moreno Valley, California on July 7th of 2005. And Ray Griecar, who was an attorney out of Pennsylvania, who went missing on April the 15th of 2005. Those cases were in there. In 2004, the case of Amber Cates out of Tennessee. She's an April 11th missing person. And in 2003, there was Jennifer Markham and Alexis Patterson, who went missing from Lakewood, Colorado, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Respectively, they went missing on February the 17th and May 1st of 2003. I don't know if I said 2003 correctly, but this one is, so these two are from 2003. In 2002, Rachel Cook went missing on January 10th from Georgetown, Texas. She was a jogger who went missing. And then in 2001, we had Stephen Kraft from Benton Harbor, Michigan on February the 15th, Bethany Markowski from Jackson, Tennessee on March the 4th, Shanna Kirkpatrick from Portland, Oregon on April the 4th, 2001. And then in the year 2000, we had the Asha Degree case in the comparison searches. In the year 1999, there was Rolando Solis Jusino. He's out of Puerto Rico on July the 7th. Susie Lyle is in there from 1998. She went missing from Albany, New York on March the 2nd. In 1997, Kristen Modafferi went missing from San Francisco, California. That was a June 23rd, 1997 case. And the now closed and resolved case of Kristen Smart, who went missing from San Luis Obispo, California. She has not been found and no justice has come, but arrests have been made in that case. So in my mind, I think it's about to be closed and archived. They did find evidence that she had been found, she had been buried one place and potentially moved, according to the local police there. That's May 26th of 1996. And then there was the Michaela Garrett case from 1988, who went missing from Hayward, California. She was November 19th, 1988. And I believe that case is coming up on some resolution similarly to Kristen Smart. And then the Daniel Barter case. And Daniel Barter was out of Lillian, Alabama on June 18th of 1959. So those cases were in there. There were three cases at the bottom of the list that we thought we knew who one of them was. We considered whether comparison searches that came up resolved and archived. There are three of them. One is number 898, one is 4241, and one is 5407. Once NamUs closes and archives a case, it's nearly impossible to get the information for who it was. Well, the case owner can tell you who it is. And I have narrowed these three down to my three best guesses. And the very first one in there, 898, that's the lowest number on the list, so I went looking for it first. Based on the timing and the entries around it and the age of NamUs at the time, I believe that 898 is the closed, archived, and resolved case of Brooke Wilberger. Brooke Wilberger was a victim of another serial killer that we will talk about again. We've spoken about him a little bit. We talked about him in season 1. This is Joel Courtney. The reason that it's probably this case is the NamUs cases end right before that case with W's who went missing in Oregon. Well, the next case in line would be Brooke. Brooke was missing at the time those cases would have been entered. There was resolution in that case. Now, I'm not necessarily referencing the day Brooke went missing. I'm talking about when the NamUs cases would have been entered.
Not much has been disclosed in the Wilberger case about where the crime actually took place. Authorities say it happened in the woods in Benton County in Coastal Range. And for the people who live in that area, they say they can't believe something like this could have happened in their backyard. On Highway 20, just about 15 miles west of Corvallis, sits the town of Blodgett.
This is a real, nice community, and, bad stuff just never happens out here. It just doesn't.
But people here started to question that reputation after authorities disclosed a few details about where Brooke Wilberger was murdered.
They said coastal region, Benton County, and Benton County only goes so far.
Leading many locals here to think this deserted road was the location Joel Courtney took Brooke Wilberger the day he killed her.
It's kind of eerie that he went and he could have been in here. He could have been in here the next day, the day before.
Mark Scacco owns the Blodgett Country Store, which is about 3 miles from where he thinks the crime was committed. He says he's surprised it could have happened so close to home.
Some of us actually did search that area because it's a little abandoned road, and nobody seen anything. So, if something wants to be hidden, it can be hidden very well.
But the news about Wilberger hasn't changed their attitude about Blodgett.
We love it here, and we just are so sorry that this happened, but it doesn't change our feeling about the community.
And no one worries there's anything else hidden in these woods.
I'm not going to pick up my bags and leave. This is my hometown, and anywhere you go, it can happen.
Joel Courtney is currently an inmate at the Central New Mexico Correctional Facility, and some say he could end up spending the rest of his life in that prison. In Blodgett, Jeff Skrypek, KEZI 9 News.
And what brought the resolution to the case was when a plea deal was cut, one of the contingencies in the plea deal was that her remains be disclosed. Her remains were disclosed at the time that Joel Courtney pled guilty, and that case finally was archived much later than when she went missing. The other two that are in here, 4241 and 5407, are complicated. We're going to talk about 4241 last, but right now we're going to discuss who is likely name is case number 5407. And she was found in the right time frame to be resolved and archived, because the way the FBI was running these cases, it has to be a case that was open for keys to look at on that computer, which would have been late 2010 up to early 2012, but closed by the time the FBI was doing the recognized comparison searches with the NamUs database, which we anticipate was in 2012 and 2013. Does that about sum up what we're doing here, Meg?
I think so.
And this is very complicated to do. One of the things that we were sort of tasked with doing was hunting down these numbers. We believe that 5407 was a girl named Brittany Pert. Now, Brittany Pert disappeared from Elkton, Maryland around July 25th of 2008. And then in December of 2011, her skeletal remains were found in a wooded area that was just south of Newark, Delaware. The cause of death has not been determined to this day. The Delaware Office of the Medical Examiner positively identified the remains of Brittany Pert.
Okay, so from December 4th, 2011, when they were found, there's an article that does not have anything that appears to be updated, but it was published on December 12th, 2011. So you're talking about 8 days. I know that's quick. However, I believe that they had everything in place for
it
her
looks
to
like they had her dental records already with the
identified.
state police. So
Right. And so part of the situation with this case and another case we're going to talk about is there weren't that many options. It could only be so many people, I guess would be a good way to put it. I don't know the ins and outs of everything. Nobody's ever been charged with her murder.
Her case is just an open case. It's not attributed to anything. There's a few theories on the internet if you start looking, but they don't seem to really have added up to much. That's a long time. Like, that's 3 years.
Right. And so my guess is somebody took her disappearance to heart. And I would imagine probably leading up to this particular set of remains being found and identified as her, they were probably on it. And so it just so happened to work out the area that she was found in, the area she went missing in. It wasn't far. Like where she was found was not far from where she went missing.
Right. And it's a weird case. So she was last seen or heard from on July 25th, 2008. She'd had a disagreement with her mother and she packed a bag and she left their Elkwood Estates home about 1 a.m. A week later, they find her 2003 Pontiac Sunbird parked at an intersection at Main and Rooney Streets, which is not terribly far from where she went missing. It's in an area called Northeast. Her bag was inside of the car and the keys were in the console. Now, in October of 2009, her parents were divorced, but they hired a private detective named Harry McDaniel, who was a retired Maryland State Police investigator who, at the time, said that he believed that Pert had relocated to a major city where she could blend in. McDaniel helped the family compose a letter to the Maryland State Police Cold Case Unit, which in turn added Brittany Pert's case to its files. What's so interesting about this area, she is missing in one state, but needs to be reported in the other state because she's right on the edge. And where they find her remains, it turns out to be, I think you described it as almost like somebody pushed her over the state line.
It's very close.
So they had been looking in Canal National Refuge off of 3rd Street over in Chesapeake City. Now, this is back in July when she went missing. They received some information that they've never released. They said heated up the case. Ultimately, though, she was found by hunters. This is on December 4th of 2011. Hunters found her remains in the woods just south of Newark, Delaware. Why this is interesting to me is it's a pretty accessible area. It is technically an area, obviously, where you would hunt and fish. But how she fits to Israel Keyes for the moment is not did he do it. That's not what we're talking about. What this fits in is she had photos that were available in the press during the time that it would have taken for Israel Keyes to have had him on his computer's browser cache that would match in the recognized comparison searches. See, here's what you have to remember about those searches. They can only do those searches with photos. They don't have names attached to them. They don't have numbers attached to them. A photo recognize, which is REK, recognize, is literally facial matching software. So they're taking a picture and they're comparing it to the NamUs database. Basically what they did is they gathered one set of pictures, they manually sorted them by hand, they go over here to the NamUs database, and side by side, they put them through a computer program that was advanced for the time, is sort of slow now, that would compare it to any available photos in NamUs. And that's how we know who he had gone and looked at. And we're not talking about in NamUs. We're talking about he looked at pictures of them somewhere on the internet. That's all we know is he looked at them on his computer.
And that photo was cached in his machine.
Right.
And when the cache, there were over 50,000 images on his computer.
I think it's even more than that. Hold on.
Possibly. I have that in my head, though. And so what I'm saying is, I've said sort of from the very beginning, there could be something to the NamUs search. I've never agreed with anything I've heard said about the NamUs search. In all likelihood, it's as close to irrelevant as it could be without actually being irrelevant. And you and I have, I think our opinions differ on this, but there's several outliers in the list that you gave that lead me to believe that there is no definitive accuracy from the information that we had. And I've scoured the vault for additional information, and it's just not there. I feel like there would have been a way to find out, okay, why are these showing up? But I think the point is missed that he could have literally looked at any news article, anything about any of these people, and the pictures would have cached, and then they would have matched.
Right. For the purpose of what we're talking about today, we're not adding any of this to the list of Israel Keyes victims or whatever. We are simply looking for what does this information mean from the perspective of we have a number, we're told that this case is closed, resolved, and archived, and we can't get anything else. We were able to go look at all these other NamUs people. So we're able to look at 40 some of them. We wanted to look at the last couple. So Brooke Wilberger is 898, and we believe that Brittany Pert is 5407. We also have a candidate for 4241. But before we talk about her, I want to talk about an interesting side note related to Brittany Pert. There's another woman found in roughly that area in January of 2016. Her remains there. So she went missing, and this is so vague, sometime from a medical facility or shortly after she had left a medical facility in Maryland, sometime in 2010. So that's as clear as the information is going to get here. But she's interesting because it's the same area that Brittany Pert was found at. And it looks like she could have been dumped from Interstate 95 at the location that she was, but it's very close to Brittany. Investigators have identified human remains discovered near an Elkton area road in January 2016 as those of Dorothy Diane Stokes, a woman who had been receiving an unspecified treatment in a yet-to-be-identified Maryland Medical Center sometime in 2010, which is when her 2 adult daughters in Arkansas had last heard from her. Now, with the identification of Stokes marking a major piece of the puzzle in place, Cecil County Sheriff's Office investigators are trying to determine when Stokes was last seen, how and when she died, and how her remains wound up in the area of the T intersection of West Chestnut Hill and Iron Hill roads, which are off of Route 279. This is northeast of Elkton, near the Delaware state line. On January 7, 2016, a road crew supervisor contacted Cecil County Sheriff's Office after workers found an unspecified amount of human remains close to a dead end on West Chestnut Road, a short distance from the road. Forensic examiners with the Maryland Medical Examiner's Office in Baltimore quickly concluded that the remains were human bones, but it took more than 10 months before they determined that the remains were those of a female. These bones have been here for multiple years, Lieutenant Michael Holmes said. They were assisted by the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification in Fort Worth, Texas, which, so you guys are aware, this is also where NamUs is. The University of North Texas Center for Human Identification specializes in DNA testing. Within the past month or so, through their DNA testing and other specific identifiers, they firmly identified Mrs. Stokes. Because they now have a name linked to those remains, CCSO detectives can better reach out to police agencies throughout the United States for help in this open death investigation. According to Holmes, after the remains were found, CCSO investigators contacted numerous police agencies in the region to check on open missing persons reports. First were for general missing persons reports, and then 10 months later, only files concerning women who had vanished. Those efforts yielded nothing helpful. We reached out to agencies pretty much nationwide, but we still have not located any active missing persons reports concerning Ms. Stokes, Holmes said. For the past few weeks, ever since the revelation of Stokes' identity, CCSO detectives also began investigating and researching Stokes' background, relatives, associates, and so forth. Holmes reported that this was a very active investigation, and investigators were able to make contact with 2 daughters of Mrs. Stokes who reside in Arkansas. Investigators later learned that their last contact with the deceased was in 2010, noting that it was only a phone conversation. Stokes would have been either 47 or 48 years old at the time of the phone contact with her daughters. In 2018, Stokes would have turned 56. Holmes also reported the daughters advised the deceased had received treatment in a medical facility in Maryland. They had not yet determined the medical facility because Stokes' daughters did not know, and they declined to specify the type of medical treatment that Stokes was receiving. This woman had been sort of transient. She had lived in several states before coming to Maryland, and Holmes outlines, and he declines to elaborate what's going on in Stokes' life and why she's so nomadic. But CCSO detectives are hoping that someone can provide information regarding the last time that Stokes was seen alive, which might allow them to gain a better idea of when she died. Holmes reiterates that all the detectives know now is that the found remains have been here for many years, and it also might shine a light on who, if anyone, Stokes was with when she was last seen. This is a really random case. First of all, I wanted to know, how did they identify her at all?
Yeah, I imagine they got DNA from the daughters. That would be my guess.
I totally understand that, but how did they know to get DNA from the daughters? Because the way it reads is they matched and then talked to the daughters. So I couldn't even find a missing persons report anywhere in Arkansas that references this one.
There's not one. I actually think that I don't think the daughters ever considered her to be missing.
Yeah, they thought that she was just no longer in their life.
Right. And so you're right. That is interesting. I wonder, do you happen to know, well, you have stumped me.
What I thought was...
I was going to say, do you know if she was on probation or something like that?
No, I looked for wanted records. I assume, the way they talk about her, I'm going to make an educated guess here. it sounds like they're referencing drug use.
She's in rehab.
Rehab facility for drug use. And it sounds like they're referencing her being nomadic for drug use and prostitution. That's
right.
They don't say that, though. That's me just trying to connect some dots.
Well, I mean, what else is there?
Well, essentially...
Yeah, if you're not found, like, in the woods, dead...
then people would never know.
8 years after you were missing.
So what's so interesting about her to me is she was found fairly close to Brittany Pert. And the other part is she fits the timeline of Israel Keyes for not having been found. And in some ways, she resembles Deborah Feldman.
You mean their lifestyles?
Height, weight, hair. They both have blonde hair. Yeah. They're similar age. Their height and their weight are similar. What was interesting about her to me is I wondered if she might have somehow been one of the road victims, where he talks about taking someone from one state and leaving them in another state. And we've been overthinking that in our head, where the FBI leads you to believe that they picked up that Keyes picks up Deborah Feldman in New Jersey and rapes her in Massachusetts and dumps her body in New York. Realistically, it's more like this, where they're picked up in one state and dropped in the next state or right on the edge of the state lines in wooded areas. That's just one of the many things that I'm running down in the Israel Keyes case. So I got one more thing to talk about today, but I know this is not as exciting as like some of the other Keyes stuff. Do you have anything to say about either?
No, I think you need to make the connection as to why you are bringing these up. We went through the NamUs cases.
There's a number of things. You're talking about the timeline?
Well, yeah, because I feel like...
Specifically, we had a problem with the Deborah Feldman case because you had pointed out early on, you felt like he made an error. And he talks about making errors and like misstating. And he talks about how it's not crystal clear to him anymore. He remembers the highlights, if you will, but he doesn't necessarily remember the dates, the years, and the specifics when it comes to sitting down and being put on the spot and having to regurgitate them. Is that what you're referencing?
Well, not really, but since we're talking about it, to kind of put this out there, what happens is he denies Deborah Feldman. He sits down in a very cordial diplomatic meeting, and he is told, well, we know you typed her name in your computer, right? Trying to find it. And then he's pushed further and he says, well, I'm not going to tell you now, because he needed leverage to get some things he wanted done as far as like getting property returned or whatever. And so they said, so there's more to the story. And he says, well, yeah, there's more to the story and I'll get to it, but we need to take care of these other things first. Do you recall that? Like I just recalled it?
Yes, that's very similar.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And so I feel like the more to that story would have been, I was looking up this other woman, which has been your theory all along.
Right. There's a different Deborah Feldman who is Deborah instead of Debra. And that's what he typed in the computer. He typed in the other person's name. And I believe that her story was a New York story about a woman who went missing and then was part of an isolated community. And there was a lot of graphic details she had put about the Orthodox community that she had come from in this story. And in terms of our timeline in 2011, 2012, she was publishing a book and she was doing a book tour. So she was on a lot of radio stations. She was on the front pages of multiple newspapers. She was in a lot of headline articles on the internet, and she was talking a lot, like openly talking about her story on all of the morning shows and several evening news programs. So she was in the news, and like him having had the computer, I believe that he might have typed in Deborah Feldman, meaning that Deborah Feldman, who at this point she has a show that came out on Netflix called Unorthodox. What was interesting about the other Deborah Feldman is that there was nothing to search for related to her.
The Deborah Feldman that he was actually looking for, her subject matter is in a way like it's religious, and then it's religious oppression. And that's actually something that would go right along with Keyes' interests.
Absolutely, I agree. And that comes up several times. There's several topics that come up this summer where we're going to talk about how him searching for one thing might have led to coming across another thing. But in this instance, we don't think he killed Deborah Feldman. I don't think he killed Deborah Feldman. Let me rephrase that. What do you think?
I'm not convinced. I felt like it was. So the reason Deborah Feldman came to light was because she was the only victim that could fit the set of circumstances that he was saying. Essentially, it was a murder right before the Tupper Lake bank robbery. And the way he tells the story, it becomes that she's the only missing person in the system that it could possibly be. If you listen later, so this would be in like October when he's talking with investigators, he says some of the things aren't clear anymore. And I realized that I used to know all this stuff and now it's getting hazy. And I'm paraphrasing here, but I think that under all the circumstances, because he had this chip on his shoulder that investigators had gone like behind his back, so to speak, looking for, additional victims, and they were doing their own investigation, which of course we all knew that they would be doing, but for some reason it shocked him, and it got him, that was one of the most, he got more irritated about that than he got about other things. You can hear it in his voice. He was surprised, for one thing, I guess, that they had, brought her picture to his attention. And there's all kinds of stuff about like his reactions to that and everything. And unless it happened an additional time that wasn't in the interviews, I don't pick up on what anybody said he did when he saw Deborah Feldman's picture.
Yeah, the interpretations of that have been wrong for me as well. I'll go ahead
because to me, he literally is going, well, I have no idea how to explain this. I have no idea who that is.
Yeah, that's exactly. He has a look on, like, I'll explain it this way. My teenager, when they're guilty of something, they have one look. But when I accuse them of something they truly haven't done and have no idea what I'm talking about, it's that look.
Well, and you have to keep in mind also that this is coming, this is leading up to ultimately his suicide. And I feel like a lot of things started coming unraveled. And I think Deborah Feldman, it was surprising in so many ways to him. And I'm not going to say like for certain he didn't kill her, but like I feel like everybody should like look at the accounts that have been given and like think for themselves about it, because I didn't get that same impression. And that actually was sort of a turning point for me, because I realized the track the investigators were on and what they were seeing. And I realized how different what I was seeing was, because I saw a guy who was ticked off that his former girlfriend's house had been ransacked and property was taken. And so I imagined she was getting on to him about it, and he's trying to leverage that to get her stuff back. And then he's going, wait, I'm going to tell you everything. Why are you looking into this? And, you're wrong, not to mention, I mean, he doesn't flat out say that. But then he also goes into, well, I realized like I'm wrong about some things. And to me, I felt like he was backpedaling, because he realized they found this woman who's missing, apparently. I don't know anything about her. Her name's on my computer. And like, this is how this is going to go. I can just sort of see it exploding, because there's nothing he can do about it at that point. The facts line up. It's just this crazy set of circumstances.
And what's so interesting is one of the things that he says along the way is he says, look, I've realized that you guys know a lot of things about me on paper. And the way that he's phrasing this conversation, like you just described, there's almost a disbelief that comes over, where it's basically, I can't believe that you guys, one, are thinking this stuff and I don't remember it, so I'm wrong. And then two, he's thinking, they're never going to find anything that I did. Just like the courier's bodies, there's no reason to tell these people anything because they have no idea what they're doing.
Right. And so at that point, they weren't taking his response to their question about, do you know this woman? Is this the woman whose remains are in New York? That kind of, when they're asking him that stuff and he's saying, no, they're not believing him, which I'm not saying they should believe him. But you have to keep in mind, Israel Keyes, I would say his number one objective was to control the narrative of his story. Okay.
And he did, because everything they profile about him came out of his mouth.
Well, right. But you have to keep in mind also, though, that you get to a point where if you're controlling the narrative and you've got facts stacking up against you, which is what is happening here, right? I have always thought he wanted to do what he did and get away with it. And he was scared to death that his mother and or daughter were going to discover these terrible things he had done. That's his whole point in wanting to control the narrative. He didn't care what anybody else found out or whatever. He didn't want to lose the position that he had, alternative ego that he had presented to his mother and daughter for all those years. And I feel like this unraveling, it really, it was really hard on him because he realized, I'm trying to control this narrative. I can't control this narrative. And I don't know what to do here, because essentially what they told him, how can he deny it any more than saying, that's not the case, I didn't do it. Now he could have said, well, I was looking for this other Deborah Feldman, but I don't know that they would have believed that any more than him saying, no, I didn't do that.
All honesty, I don't know that he would have made the connection to the two.
But he says there's more to the story. So I do think he made the connection. I think the more to the story, because he says that, because they're pressing him and they won't stop. Okay?
I felt like the more to the story was his way out. You're saying that you don't think that's the case.
I think that the explanation, it's possible that he wanted to hold on to his explanation because he wanted to absorb what was happening there. I think you have to keep in mind also, he repeated that back to somebody.
Right, to Feldis or Russo.
Because he said, so I'm right about her. There's more to this. And he's like, well, yeah, there's more to the story.
Right, but he's not confirming Deborah Feldman.
Feldis was very, I'm right. I'm right. Tell me I'm right. He wanted to be confirmed. What do you do when you're trapped in a room with somebody that's doing that? What else could you do?
If you're in Israel Keyes' shoes, I don't know what you do there.
You say, yeah, there's more to the story.
Yeah, apparently you do.
What do you do? He wasn't. So if you listen to that whole series of interviews there, where this comes up and it's being tossed, and I think it comes up maybe more than once. I can't remember exactly, but the feeling I got was it was very uncomfortable. Feldis wanted to have solved something, and that really irked Keyes, really irked him. And when you are stuck in a room, which he wasn't stuck in the room with him, he could go back to jail anytime he wanted to.
This was vacation for him.
Right. And so, if you have somebody that's made up their mind about something, which I feel like they had made up their mind about this, it is entirely possible that he did kill Deborah Feldman, and I'm completely wrong about all of it. Okay. But his reactions, that is believable if you just read the accounts of the interviews where somebody says, he looked away in disgust at her picture, whatever's been said. But if you watch it, that's not the vibe I'm getting. I never got that vibe.
And this is one of the interviews that we were able to get on video. So we are able to see this interview, and it's not just that we're hearing his voice, we're actually able to see his face. So we're not making this. I think the assumption was that this would only be released in audio form, and that's why authors took liberty when they described these instances. Because this is the Deborah Feldman was a a beef for me early on in this was I did not think that he killed Deborah Feldman. Look, I am not the FBI. I am not going to be charging dead Israel Keys with Deborah Feldman's murder because I have no jurisdiction to do so. I'll just say that in terms of gathering evidence and figuring out the rest of this stuff, I don't think that Deborah Feldman should be on that list.
I don't either. Well, I'm not
And
sure.
to correct American Predator Maureen Callahan, her remains have not been found in New York.
Right. What the heck was that? That actually was very confusing. Deborah Feldman is still very much a missing person. And
unless the FBI only reported that to Maureen Callahan because whatever, that has never been released, and she is still considered a missing person to this day. She was not found in New York.
that was really crazy. And I'm not sure if she was the only source of that chaos. So just saying. All I wanted to say was you said that you thought maybe people didn't know that we were going to see the video. And that's why they've made these sort of descriptions. But don't you think they could have genuinely thought they saw what they saw?
I mean, I'm sure they could have. They could just be wrong. I'm trying to give them the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just curious because I picked up things, I noticed things throughout watching the interview, listening to the interview. That's where I got the majority of the information that I know about this case from him, specifically out of his mouth, in what he did and didn't answer, what he said and didn't say. Like, so it's both positive and negative space here I'm looking at. And I feel like, my assessment's really good for me, but I wouldn't say that, I don't feel like everybody would see it the way I saw it.
Right. And one of the reasons that we've stuck out this case as long as we have, and for as many episodes as we did last year and now going to do this summer, the fact that Israel Keys is deceased means that we can take a pretty nice swing at this case. And we don't have to worry about messing with any kind of legal strategy or affecting adjudications. That's one of the things about this case that's very attractive. Okay, so to wrap up today's episode, because there was this one period of time that the FBI had focused on. They focused on it in the Dateline special. The way that I went about finding these missing persons cases was really strange. First of all, they had to be resolved and archived, and they had to be in a time frame where they could be on the browser cache of this computer he'd had for just a couple years, because he, described putting another computer in a landfill, and he's about to replace Kimberly's computer, who is his partner that he lived with. I went through newspaper clippings for years looking for the slightest inkling of missing persons cases. And I found one that fit this 2007 timeframe where he had moved to Alaska and then come back. There were a lot of things in the FBI's timeline indicating that his partner, Kimberly, had been elsewhere. And they attribute some of them to Keys when they're not attributed to Keys. You can go back and listen to our earlier episodes where we talk about this. When I go through, I was looking for one specific thing. I was looking for little talked about missing persons cases that had photographs, because that's the key to the comparison searches. They have to have a picture, whether he's looking at that picture or just looking about an article and like it's the next article or whatever. These pictures have to end up on Israel Keys' computer. That was the only criterion I had. And I came across a very weird case. This is not the missing persons case that I started with, but I do believe that this is NamUs person 4241. That's because of the entries immediately before and immediately after, who they were entered by, relevant to the law enforcement agencies and NamUs, and where the other cases were entered from. One of the things I noticed about the Oregon missing persons cases going into NamUs is they tended to happen chronologically and alphabetically at the same time. This was a case that was resolved and archived. But how that case starts out is with a clipping from the Albany Democrat Herald, May 5th of 2007. And this is the person I believe his name is 4241. They repeat her picture 3 times, including in 2011 and in 2012. The article reads simply, "Woman missing, suicide suspected." And it says, Mid-Valley law enforcement officers have searched since Thursday for a Corvallis woman who is feared to have drowned herself in the Willamette River. The Corvallis Police Department and the Benton County Sheriff's Office reported Friday in a joint release. The two agencies gave this account. On Thursday, a family member of Gloria Jean Knoll advised the Corvallis Police Department that Knoll, 56, was missing and possibly suicidal. An envelope was found Thursday in the mailbox of Knoll's ex-husband, dated April 30th, 2007. Inside the envelope was what appeared to be some form of suicide note and other personal property. The note also indicated her vehicle would be parked at the OSU crew docks and her apartment keys and some other items would be found inside. Corvallis Police and Oregon State Police located her vehicle with her personal property inside at the Oregon State University crew docks. Corvallis police officers searched the residence, found additional items to suggest her intentions of committing suicide. Family members indicated they believed she may have committed suicide by drowning in the Willamette River. Corvallis police determined that she most likely entered the Willamette River from the OSU crew dock sometime between Monday and Thursday. The sheriff's office joined in the investigation and activated search and rescue, as well as the Marine Patrol, in an effort to locate Knoll in the river. Members of the search and rescue teams located a pair of shoes on the dock that may likely belong to Knoll. Knoll had not been located as of Friday afternoon. She's described as white, 5'6" and 165 pounds, with graying hair and dark eyes. Okay, so that's not super interesting on the surface of it all, but it does appear that that would be the correct entry in NamUs for Oregon, alphabetically and chronologically, at the time that 4241 was entered into NamUs.
I didn't initially know where you were going with this, but I think it actually it's an excellent example of where we started as far as trying to make sense out of information that we found. And so I'm going to try to explain what I mean by that. So Keyes is known to have been not in Alaska during the end of April, beginning of May of 2007. He has traveled, that's when they go to Mexico, that's when they're in California, and finally from Oakland, California, they fly to Seattle, and I say they because he was with his girlfriend at the time, and then finally on May 4th from Seattle to Anchorage, he flies home, okay? And so you just illustrated how, given the surrounding entries of NamUs, a closed case from NamUs that would make sense for entry 4241, which you're absolutely right. Now, there are exceptions to this, but got to keep in mind, NamUs, a lot of the entries start in 2008.
Right.
And because of that, you've got you've got pre-existing open cases being entered, from stacks of cases over a period of time. It makes logical sense they would be in alphabetical order, even regardless of the last seen date or whatever. And so this case makes sense that her picture would have been in NamUs as a missing person. And it makes sense. It has nothing to do with Keyes, okay? However, he was looking for information about someone that has something to do with Keyes.
Right. So to give you an example of how I got here, because this is the one case I can really do it with, do you mind if I take a moment?
No, go ahead. I agree. I think
so. Missing person number 4240 is Shana Ashley Kirkpatrick out of Portland, Oregon, who had been missing since April 4th of 2001, a 1-year-old kid who had been missing all this time. The interesting part about that is the NamUs case for Shana Kirkpatrick was created on December 22nd, 2009. That's the holiday time. It's a good time to catch up on everything. And what I realized was, I went through these bizarre partial remains cases. On April 22nd of 2010, There was another article also with Gloria Knoll's photo in the Corvallis Gazette-Times out of Corvallis, Oregon. And here's what it says to illustrate my point. A Texas lab has confirmed that a leg discovered on the banks of the Willamette River belongs to a Corvallis woman who was reported as missing and suicidal in May of 2007. Yamhill County Sheriff Jack Crabtree said the leg identified as that of Gloria Jean Knoll was found by hunters in October of 2008, 5 months after a different leg was recovered in the river between Salem and Independence. A family member reported to police on May 3, 2007 that Knoll was missing and possibly suicidal, and then it rehashes the same information that we've already talked about. But according to the Yamhill County Sheriff's Office, the remains were sent to the Texas lab, along with DNA and blood samples of Knoll, and the lab matched the two legs with Knoll's DNA. Here's why that case would have gotten in there. In order for the university there at North Houston to do this kind of comparison, they would want to use it under NamUs because NamUs was new at the time and struggling with some funding issues. This would be a big boost for them to be able to put in a missing person and then turn around and use that missing person's case to show what their lab could do by identifying these two legs that have been found in the river. Just there in that article, it is confirmed they went into the UNH system, which means they more than likely went into NamUs. They would go in on December 22nd, 2009 in order to create a profile for Gloria Jean Knoll. But pretty much as soon as it goes in, it gets cleared as resolved and archived. What makes it interesting is Shana Kirkpatrick's case is an old Portland, Oregon case that would be going in out of Multnomah County. So that case going in as NamUs missing person 4240, and then this case going in as NamUs missing person 4241, even though it's cleared pretty quickly, matches. The next thing that happens as far as these comparison searches go is she appears in news articles in April of 2010 and again in April of 2011. They're the same article, basically just confirming that she has been found. The April 2010 is enough for me to look at it and go, okay, that person's picture could be in Israel Key's computer. And I believe he had to have had looked up this 2010 article.
I don't think he looked up the article. I think what he put in produced the article. So what did he search for to get it?
Missing woman, 2007, Oregon.
Right. I feel like that was probably the best explanation that we've given. And I'm not entirely sure everybody's going to follow it, but I followed it.
They were putting in April, Oregon cases that had started with a K. This is an April, Oregon case, and Kirkpatrick is 4240, and Knoll, Knoll, is the next person.
Right, and so that follows a logical sequence that makes sense.
Right. So that, in my idea, the case owner could confirm that to us. In this case, it's a woman from NamUs is actually the case owner because it has a federal nexus in the 4240 case. I believe she is the case owner of 4240 and 4241 because she's the regional specialist for that area. She just happens to have both of these locations. So he was looking for missing women in Oregon in April of 2007.
Right. And so that's why her picture was both in NamUs and we're talking about 4241, who we are speculating is Gloria Knoll from all logical points of view. And so who went missing in April of 2007? That is his victim.
That's where we pick up next week when we start to talk about what we're hunting for other potential victims and some of the things that other sources have pointed out related to different cases and what they may mean, because we don't necessarily agree with another missing persons case that has been attributed to Israel Keys. And that case is a case out of Texas.
Well, yeah, I would go ahead and say that. Well, that doesn't have anything to do with the NamUs, though.
No, he just didn't kill Jimmy Tidwell.
No, I don't think you did either. But that was actually really good. And so I'm glad you went ahead and pushed through because, my initial thing is like, we're not going to talk about this poor lady who committed suicide.
I was just trying to show what the comparison search
that was
meant.
excellent. You did a good job. I couldn't have done it. I couldn't have done that because it wouldn't have come out that way. But you're exactly right. The way that you explained that case is exactly what I was thinking happened. And it just so happened that we didn't have this identity. And we don't know for 100% sure that it is her, but what you're saying makes good sense. Okay.
Right. And that's all I was trying to say. As far as Gloria goes or doesn't go, that's a leap for me to imagine Keyes figuring that out.
Keyes did not do that, but
no, I'm not saying he did. I'm just saying
that.
Like you and I talking is one thing, but I apply what you said about the couriers is how would that have looked if we didn't know what he said? And that, like, I apply that to Gloria and I go, okay, it's highly unlikely she's a victim because I really like him for Rebecca Noel Bramall. The same day.
At that time?
Yeah, same day, but it's a different girl in Oregon. Now, she's not publicized. We're talking about her a little bit next week. We talked about her before. She's not publicized as much. There's no pictures out there, really. The only picture they ever put out was her DMV photo. But my point is, like, I think that more than likely, this woman is the 4241 in NamUs. And that is what brought that comparison up because he happened to look at this article about her.
Right, but it had nothing to do. She has nothing to do with him. It's just
that's what I think.
He's punching in circumstances. You have to think about how, because he even talks about it, like how he would. Oh, I need to go check on that and see. He would type stuff in.
Yeah.
And so I think for the most part,
April 2007, it will be an Oregon victim.
I think that for the most part, every single NamUs connection to his computer is going to be a roundabout connection to a victim. I don't think it's not as straightforward as it's been presented or it may seem.
Thank you for joining us for our Cruel Summer episodes, where we go back to looking at Israel Keyes. We are sponsored by LabRottiCreations.com. You can check them out at LabRottiCreations.com, and you can still use the code CRIMEXS for a fun pop pet portrait of your own pet. You can also reach us on Twitter, Instagram at TrueCrimeXS, or you can give us a call if you know anything about any of the cases that we're talking about at 252-365-5593. You can also reach us at Gmail at truecrimexs@gmail.com, and you can check out our website at www.truecrimexs.com. We'll see you next time.
This is True Crime XS.
Well, it should be interesting to see how the 10th anniversary of Israel Keyes being arrested and all of that explodes. I assume there'll be a lot that attracts attention to him. There's this one case that I can't get my hands on. I can't get my hands on the file for it. And it's one of the only cases that really makes me angry because the FBI has no reason to hold the information back on this case, and yet they do it. They just sit there on it. And that's probably one of the most frustrating things about solving the Israel Keyes case is clearly the FBI has had 10 years to solve anything about the Israel Keyes case. And either they're not releasing it, they didn't do anything to further the investigation into what he was really doing. Now, part of that's Keyes' fault, and part of that's because they keep sitting on information. I've never seen the amount of information sat on that they have. Release some of the jail calls. Just blur out the other people's voices where, it's a robot voice or something. Release enough information. Release the writings from his cell. Let people take a look at what he was really saying there. Maybe it was just some bizarre poetry like the suicide note that he left. But there is one case, and I look at this case, and I've tried to get information from the locals. I've tried to get information from the feds. They're not going to give up the information on it. My guess is it's the deciding factor in a lot of things about Israel Keyes. And I think the ultimate question that it answers is that Israel Keyes killed prostitutes. I think that case would prove it, and they don't want anybody to know that.
Woke up with a cloud over my windowsill. Some days I swear the weatherman is out for me. I've been locked inside thinking about sunlight. Woke up with the thought, maybe it's all for now. Maybe it's all for now. The highs and the lows get me, you see. I'm just not into it. I'm broke down, exposed now. With low clouds, there's nothing to cover me. There's nothing to cover me. Think back to the times when the sky was clear. I had visions of launching into the atmosphere. Now here on the ground, waiting for departure. Think back to the day before the colors fade. The highs and the lows get me, you see. I'm just not into this. I'm broke down, exposed now. With low clouds, there's nothing to cover me. There's nothing to cover me. When will the rain stop falling? When will I see the sun again, sun again? When will the rain stop falling? When will I see the sun again, sun again? The sun again. The highs and the lows get me, you see. I'm just not into it. I'm broke down, exposed now. With low clouds, there's nothing to cover me.